question for you. Why might police officers be distrustful of psychologists? Think about that for a second. Actually, why might the general public be distrustful of psychologists? And unfortunately, I think that there's a stigma to therapy in the United States. And now couple that with the thought that the police psychologist might directly have an impact on that officer's job in the future, and you can see a scenario in which a police officer might be distrustful. Not only that, think about police culture, and police are typically men, and they're kind of macho guys, and if they're women, they're kind of tough women. And they might not look positively on seeing a psychologist, and they might think of it as a character defect or a personal weakness. But police have problems. Police have problems more so than the general public. So they specifically have problems with alcoholism, suicide, domestic trouble, like domestic violence. They experience trauma, and they have a high rate of burnout in their jobs. So that's tough. I mean, think about the difference between being a police officer and working in an office somewhere. So here's some statistics. This is just to give you an idea as to the impact of the stress on a police officer's life. In the United States, a police officer commits suicide every 22 hours. Approximately 400 officers per year commit suicide. A study by Volante showed that 25% of the officers in the study were dependent on alcohol, and they also had a high incidence of cirrhosis of the liver, and that domestic violence is 2 to 4 times more common in police families than in general population. 40% of police officers in the study self-reported that they'd used violence against a domestic partner within the last year, whereas in the general public that would be about 10%. Now, not only do police officers have to deal with their own psychological problems, they also have to deal with the psychological problems of others. One of those things is a Baker Act. And a Baker Act is an involuntary commitment procedure for people that have mental illness and they're dangerous to themselves or others. So police officers are the ones that typically will not initiate, like a psychologist or social worker would initiate the Baker Act, and then, like, for example, I would call the police department, and then they would put me in contact with the Baker Act team. I would explain what was going on, and then the Baker Act team would come out and not arrest that individual, but Baker Act the individual and take them to a Baker Act receiving facility. So here in Davie, the closest one is like University Pavilion. So if a psychologist has a client that's mentally ill and dangerous to themselves or other people, they would call the police department, and then a Baker Act would be initiated. And not only that, but police officers have contact with people with mental illness all the time. And they also work with victims of trauma a lot. That's one area that you might not think about. So think about all the horrific things that police officers have to deal with, and then, they might have to deal with the victims of those crimes on an interpersonal level. I think that would be very tough. All right, now fitness for duty evaluations. Police departments have the obligation to retain and hire police officers that are psychologically fit for duty. They don't want officers on the force that are psychologically disturbed. And that's an area that a forensic psychologist really plays a role in a fitness for duty evaluation. Now, the forensic psychologist doesn't make the determination whether that individual is fit for duty or not. That would be the police chief. But their recommendations should play a big part in that determination. And there's a famous case in New York City where the wife of a police officer, what this guy did was, unfortunately, he was psychologically disturbed. He was still an officer, and he shot his wife, and then he shot himself. His wife lived, however, and then she sued the NYPD, and she was eventually awarded $500,000 in compensatory and punitive damages because it was found that the NYPD had the liability of retaining officers that were not psychologically disturbed. Okay, this last slide here is about the Stanford prison experiment and Philip Zimbardo. And if you haven't seen the videos of the Stanford prison experiment, actually I'll probably try and incorporate them into the class at some point in time. But it's a very, very poignant research study that shows how forensic psychologists might not even work with police or crimes or things like that. They might do research on the basis of criminal behavior. So that's pretty interesting. And Philip Zimbardo is a very famous psychologist in the United States. He actually came here and spoke at Nova a couple years ago. He's a former president of the American Psychological Association, and if you took Intro to Psychology, you probably read his textbook. So we'll try and incorporate that at some point. All right, so that's it for this lecture. A lot of material here, and I think this would be a fascinating job if you're interested in working with police departments or with police officers. There's lots of different ways in which you can interact with those individuals as a psychologist, and it's a viable job option that you might not consider when thinking about careers in psychology or even in forensic psychology.